New York in 1710. A complete historical documentary script. Chapter 1. The Colonial Port at the Edge of Empire. The year was 1710. Queen Anne sat upon the throne of England, and across the vast Atlantic Ocean, clinging to the southern tip of Manhattan Island, stood the small but ambitious colonial town of New York. With a population of approximately 6,000 souls, this compact settlement represented one of the most diverse and strategically important ports in all of British North America. To understand New York in 1710 is to step into a world where multiple cultures collided, where slavery and freedom existed side by side, and where the foundations of a future metropolis were being laid in ways no one could yet imagine. New York in 1710 was barely 46 years removed from its transformation from Dutch New Amsterdam to English New York. The conquest of 1664, when English warships sailed into the harbor and the Dutch surrendered without firing a shot, had changed the flag but not erased the Dutch character of the settlement. Walking the streets in 1710, a visitor would still hear Dutch spoken as commonly as English, would see Dutch architectural styles dominating the skyline, and would encounter families whose roots in this place stretched back to the original Dutch West India Company settlers. The physical boundaries of New York were remarkably compact by any modern standard. The entire settled area occupied only the southernmost portion of Manhattan Island, extending northward from the Battery at the island's tip to roughly the line of present-day Chambers Street. Beyond this boundary lay farms, orchards, and increasingly wild countryside that stretched toward the distant village of Harlem and beyond. The total area of the actual town covered less than 1 square mile. Governor Robert Hunter had arrived in 1710 to take charge of the colony, inheriting a province still recovering from decades of political turmoil. The aftermath of Leisler's Rebellion, which had torn the colony apart between 1689 and 1691, continued to divide New York society into factions that remembered old grievances and pursued ancient vendettas. Hunter faced the challenge of governing a diverse, contentious population, while also managing the strategic demands of Queen Anne's war against France. The harbor of New York represented the settlement's greatest asset and the primary reason for its existence. The deep protected waters between Manhattan, Staten Island, and Long Island provided one of the finest natural harbors on the Atlantic coast. Ships from England, the Caribbean, Africa, and the other American colonies anchored in these waters, loading and unloading cargoes that connected New York to the emerging Atlantic economy. The defensive fortifications of the town centered on Fort Anne, the structure at the southern tip of Manhattan that had been Fort Amsterdam under Dutch rule, and would be known by various names over the years. This stone fortress, mounting cannons that pointed toward the harbor entrance, represented the military heart of the colony. The governor maintained his residence within its walls, and soldiers of the colonial garrison stood watch over the approaches to the town. The famous wall that gave Wall Street its name had been demolished by 1710, but the street retained its designation and its importance. Originally constructed by the Dutch in 1653 as a defensive barrier against potential English attack from the north, the wooden palisade had served its purpose and been removed as the town expanded beyond its original boundaries. Now Wall Street functioned as one of the town's principal commercial thoroughfares. Climate shaped life in 1710 New York in ways that modern residents, with their heated buildings and air conditioning, can scarcely imagine. Winters were harsh, with the harbor occasionally freezing solid enough to walk upon. Summers brought oppressive heat and humidity that made the crowded streets nearly unbearable. Between these extremes, spring and autumn offered brief respites that residents treasured. Chapter 2. The People of Many Nations. The population of New York in 1710 represented a remarkable diversity that distinguished it from most other colonial settlements. While Boston remained predominantly English and Puritan, and Philadelphia reflected its Quaker English and Welsh founders, New York contained a mixture of nationalities, religions, and races that contemporaries found both fascinating and troubling. The Dutch remained the largest European ethnic group in 1710, despite nearly half a century of English rule. Dutch families who had arrived in the days of the West India Company continued to dominate much of the town's commerce and owned many of its finest properties. They worshipped in the Dutch Reformed Church, conducted business in their native language, and maintained cultural traditions that resisted English absorption. The great Dutch families, the Van Cortlandts, the Schuylers, the Van Rensselaers, and others, formed a colonial aristocracy whose power and influence shaped every aspect of New York life. English settlers had arrived in increasing numbers since the conquest, bringing their own language, customs, and religious practices. By 1710, English was becoming the dominant language of government and increasingly of commerce, though Dutch persisted in homes, churches, and neighborhoods throughout the town. English merchants competed with their Dutch counterparts for control of the lucrative trade networks that connected New York to the wider Atlantic world. French Huguenots, Protestant refugees who had fled Catholic persecution in France, formed another significant community. These families had arrived in waves following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which had stripped French Protestants of their legal protections. The Huguenots brought skills in crafts, trade, and the professions that made them valuable additions to the colonial economy. They established their own church and maintained their French identity even as they integrated into New York society. Jewish families, primarily Sephardic Jews, whose ancestors had fled the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, maintained a small but notable presence in 1710 New York. Congregation Shearith Israel, established in the 1650s, represented the first Jewish congregation in North America. These families engaged primarily in trade, connecting New York to commercial networks that stretched across the Atlantic and Caribbean. Germans had begun arriving in significant numbers, part of a migration that would eventually bring hundreds of thousands of German speakers to America. In 1710, Palatine German refugees, fleeing war and persecution in the Rhineland, were arriving in New York in substantial numbers. Governor Hunter struggled with the challenge of settling these newcomers, eventually placing many of them in camps along the Hudson River, where they were expected to produce naval stores for the Crown. Most significantly, and most tragically, enslaved Africans and their descendants constituted approximately 15 to 20% of New York's population in 1710. Slavery was fundamental to the colonial economy, and enslaved people labored in virtually every aspect of town life. They worked as domestic servants in wealthy households, as laborers on the docks and in workshops, as skilled craftsmen whose talents enriched their enslavers, and as agricultural workers on the farms surrounding the town. The slave market operated openly at the foot of Wall Street, where human beings were bought and sold alongside other commodities. Ships arriving from Africa and the Caribbean brought new captives to replenish and expand the enslaved population. The laws governing slavery in New York were harsh, restricting the movement, assembly, and basic humanity of those held in bondage. Yet within these constraints, enslaved Africans created communities, maintained cultural traditions, and resisted their bondage in ways both subtle and overt. Free blacks also lived in New York, a small population who had gained their freedom through manumission, self-purchase, or birth to free mothers. Their status remained precarious, their rights limited, and their presence a reminder that the boundaries between slavery and freedom were more permeable than the law suggested. Some free blacks owned property, practiced trades, and achieved modest prosperity despite the obstacles placed before them. Chapter 3: Streets, Buildings, and the Colonial Landscape. The physical appearance of New York in 1710 would strike a modern observer as more Dutch than English, more medieval than modern. The architectural legacy of New Amsterdam remained visible everywhere, from the distinctive stepped gable roofs of Dutch houses to the narrow streets that followed patterns established in the 1630s and 40s. The streets of New York were unpaved, turning to mud in wet weather and dust in dry. Cobblestones covered only the most important thoroughfares, and even these were poorly maintained. Pigs roamed freely, serving as unofficial garbage collectors by consuming the waste that residents threw into the streets. The smell of a colonial town, a mixture of human and animal waste, rotting garbage, and the various trades that operated within its boundaries, would overwhelm modern sensibilities. Broadway, already the town's principal street, ran northward from the fort toward the countryside beyond. This broad avenue, following the path of an ancient Native American trail, served as the main route for traffic entering and leaving the town. Along its length stood some of the finest houses in the colony, the residences of merchants, officials, and the colonial elite. The Dutch style of domestic architecture remained dominant in 1710. Houses typically featured their narrow ends facing the street with stepped gable roofs rising in distinctive profiles against the sky. These brick or stone structures, often painted in bright colors according to Dutch tradition, featured small windows, steep staircases, and tile roofs that gave the town a decidedly Northern European appearance. English architectural influences were gradually appearing, bringing Georgian symmetry and classical details to newer constructions. Wealthy families building or renovating homes increasingly adopted English styles, signaling their cultural allegiances through their architecture. This gradual transformation would eventually erase most visible traces of Dutch New Amsterdam, but in 1710, the transition remained incomplete. Trinity Church, established in 1697 as an Anglican parish, represented the religious establishment of English New York. The original wooden structure that stood in 1710 would later be replaced by grander buildings, but even this modest church symbolized the connection between colonial New York and the Church of England. The churchyard, already receiving the dead of the parish, would eventually become one of the oldest surviving landmarks of colonial New York. The Dutch Reformed Church continued to serve the spiritual needs of the Dutch community, conducting services in the Dutch language and maintaining the theological traditions of the Reformed faith. Other congregations served the French Huguenots, the small Jewish community, and the various Protestant denominations that found homes in New York's relatively tolerant religious environment. The waterfront dominated the eastern edge of the town, with wharves, docks, and warehouses stretching along the East River shore. Here, the business of empire was conducted daily, as ships loaded and unloaded the goods that connected New York to the Atlantic world. Merchants maintained counting houses overlooking the water, while taverns and boarding houses served the sailors and travelers who passed through the port. The Collect Pond, a body of fresh water located north of the settled area, provided water for the town and recreation for its inhabitants. This pond, which would later be filled in and forgotten beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan, supported wildlife, offered fishing and swimming, and collected the runoff from the surrounding terrain. Its waters were already showing signs of the pollution that would eventually render it unusable. Chapter 4: Commerce, Labor, and the Atlantic Economy. New York in 1710 was fundamentally a commercial town, existing primarily to facilitate the trade that connected the American colonies to England, Africa, and the Caribbean. Every aspect of town life reflected this commercial orientation, from the warehouses that lined the waterfront to the counting houses, where merchants calculated their profits and losses. The port handled an enormous variety of goods. From England came manufactured products that colonial craftsmen could not produce, or could not produce cheaply enough to compete, including fine textiles, metalware, glass, and luxury items for the wealthy. From the Caribbean came sugar, molasses, and rum, the products of the brutal plantation economy that enriched merchants on both sides of the Atlantic. From Africa came human beings, transported in conditions of almost unimaginable horror to serve as enslaved laborers in the Americas. New York exported the products of its own hinterland and the labor of its inhabitants. Flour milled from wheat grown in the Hudson Valley and on Long Island found markets in the Caribbean, where sugar plantations devoted their land to cane rather than food crops. Lumber, naval stores, and furs extracted from the forests of New York and beyond filled the holds of ships bound for England. Biscuit, provisions, and other supplies equipped the vessels that carried goods across the Atlantic. The fur trade, though diminished from its 17th century peak, remained significant in 1710. Albany, far up the Hudson River, served as the primary center for trade with Native American nations, who trapped beaver and other fur-bearing animals. These furs, transported down the Hudson to New York, crossed the Atlantic to feed European demand for felt hats and other fur products. Merchants stood at the apex of New York's commercial hierarchy. These men, often with connections to trading houses in London, Amsterdam, or other European ports, organized the complex transactions that moved goods across oceans. They extended credit, assumed risks, and accumulated the wealth that made them the dominant class in colonial society. The great merchant families lived in the finest houses, held the most important offices, and exercised influence far beyond their numbers. Craftsmen and artisans formed the productive backbone of the town's economy. Carpenters and shipwrights built and repaired the vessels that carried commerce. Coopers made the barrels that held virtually every product that moved by ship. Blacksmiths, silversmiths, tailors, shoemakers, bakers, and dozens of other tradesmen produced the goods and services that the town required. These skilled workers occupied a middle position in colonial society, prosperous enough to own their own homes and employ apprentices, but clearly below the merchant elite. The apprenticeship system governed entry into the skilled trades. Young men, typically in their early teens, bound themselves to master craftsmen for terms of 7 years or more. During this period, they learned the mysteries of their trade, received food and housing from their masters, and prepared themselves for eventual independence as journeymen or masters themselves. This system, inherited from medieval Europe, regulated the labor market and maintained standards within each craft. Enslaved labor penetrated every sector of the economy. Wealthy households employed enslaved domestic servants, while merchants used enslaved workers in their warehouses and counting houses. Craftsmen owned enslaved assistants who worked alongside free apprentices and journeymen. The docks, the streets, and the households of New York all depended on the forced labor of African and African-descended people whose bondage subsidized the prosperity of their enslavers. Chapter 5. Daily Life and Social Customs. Life in 1710, New York followed rhythms dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of commerce and labor. Without electric lighting, artificial heating beyond fireplaces, or modern conveniences of any kind, daily existence required constant adaptation to natural conditions and continuous physical labor. The day began early for most New Yorkers. Workers rose with the sun or before it, preparing for long hours of labor that would stretch until darkness made further work impossible. Merchants might keep somewhat more leisurely schedules, but the demands of commerce, tied to the arrivals and departures of ships and the hours of the markets, imposed their own discipline. Breakfast, typically eaten early and simply, might consist of bread, cheese, and beer, or cider. The main meal of the day, called dinner, was consumed in the early afternoon, when workers took a break from their labors to eat substantial fare. Supper, a lighter meal, came in the evening as the day's work concluded. The food of New York reflected its diverse population and its position as a port connected to the Atlantic economy. Dutch culinary traditions remained strong, with families consuming donuts, waffles, cookies, and other distinctive foods that would eventually become American staples. English dishes competed for space on tables, while the contributions of African cooks, working in kitchens across the town, introduced new flavors and techniques that would shape American cuisine. The availability of ingredients from the Caribbean, including sugar and molasses, added sweetness to the colonial diet. Water quality was a constant concern. The town had no piped water system, and residents obtained water from wells, springs, and the collect pond. The quality varied enormously, and contamination was common. Prudent residents boiled their water, or drank alternatives, including beer, cider, rum, and other alcoholic beverages that were considered safer than water. Clothing marked social status as clearly as any other indicator. The wealthy wore fine fabrics imported from England and the continent, including silks, velvets, and high-quality woolens. Their garments followed London fashions, adapted somewhat for colonial conditions. Men of standing wore wigs, waistcoats, and knee breeches, while women wore stays, petticoats, and gowns appropriate to their station. The working classes dressed more simply in sturdy fabrics suited to labor. Leather, linen, and coarse woolens protected workers from the elements while allowing the freedom of movement their trades required. Enslaved people typically received minimal clothing from their enslavers, often cast-off garments or cheap fabrics insufficient for the harsh winters. Entertainment and leisure took forms familiar to the early 18th century. Taverns served as social centers where men gathered to drink, gamble, discuss business and politics, and enjoy companionship. Horse racing attracted enthusiasts, while hunting and fishing provided both recreation and food. Religious services offered social as well as spiritual sustenance, bringing communities together weekly for worship and fellowship. Education remained limited and unequal. Wealthy families hired tutors or sent their sons to private schools that taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and classical languages. Girls received less formal education, learning domestic skills from their mothers, and perhaps basic literacy from tutors or schools. Poor children and enslaved children received little or no formal education, learning what they could through work and observation. Medicine in 1710, New York was primitive and often dangerous. Physicians, few in number and variable in training, offered treatments based on theories of bodily humors that had little basis in actual physiology. Bleeding, purging, and blistering were standard therapies for ailments of all kinds. Apothecaries sold medicines of dubious efficacy, while midwives attended births, and folk healers offered remedies passed down through generations. Disease was an ever-present threat. Yellow fever, spread by mosquitoes from the Caribbean, periodically devastated the town, killing hundreds and sending those who could afford to flee into the countryside. Smallpox took a regular toll, though inoculation, the deliberate infection with mild cases of the disease to produce immunity, was beginning to be understood. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses flourished in the contaminated environment. Chapter 6. Governance, Conflict, and the Colonial Order. New York in 1710 operated under a system of colonial governance that concentrated power in the hands of the royal governor, while allowing limited local participation in affairs of lesser importance. This system, designed to serve the interests of the crown and the empire, created constant tensions between colonial ambitions and imperial demands. Governor Robert Hunter, who arrived in 1710, represented the Queen's authority in the colony. He commanded the small military garrison, presided over the colonial council, and worked with the elected assembly to govern the province. His powers were extensive, but not unlimited, constrained by the need to maintain local cooperation and the impossibility of enforcing unpopular measures against a resistant population. The colonial assembly, elected by property-owning freemen, represented the political voice of the colonial elite. This body voted taxes, passed laws, and contested with governors over the boundaries of their respective powers. Membership in the assembly conferred prestige and influence, and the great families of the colony competed for seats that would allow them to shape colonial policy. The colonial council advised the governor and served as the upper house of the colonial legislature. Council members, appointed by the crown on the governor's recommendation, typically came from the wealthiest and most influential families. This body represented the closest thing to an aristocracy that colonial New York possessed. Local government in New York City operated through the Common Council, a body that managed the mundane affairs of urban life. This council regulated markets, maintained streets and wharves, and enforced local ordinances. Its members, drawn from the merchant and artisan classes, dealt with the practical challenges of keeping a growing town functioning. The legal system combined English common law with local statutes and customs. Courts at various levels handled everything from petty disputes to serious crimes. The legal profession remained small and relatively informal, with lawyers of varying qualifications appearing before judges whose own training might be limited. Justice was often swift, but not always fair, with outcomes influenced by social status, political connections, and the biases of those who administered the law. The legacy of Leisler's rebellion continued to poison New York politics in 1710. This uprising, which had briefly placed a German merchant named Jacob Leisler in control of the colony between 1689 and 1691, had divided New York into factions that persisted for generations. Leisler's execution after the restoration of regular government had made him a martyr to his supporters and a traitor to his opponents. These divisions, overlapping with ethnic, religious, and economic conflicts, made New York politics particularly contentious. Relations with neighboring colonies added another dimension to New York's challenges. Boundary disputes with New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts created ongoing tensions that occasionally erupted into open conflict. The competing claims of colonial proprietors, settlers, and Native Americans over land in the New York frontier complicated governance and occasionally led to violence. The Iroquois Confederacy, the powerful alliance of Native American nations that dominated the region north and west of New York, remained a crucial factor in colonial affairs. The covenant chain, the diplomatic relationship between the Iroquois and the English, required constant attention and frequent councils. The Iroquois served as a buffer against French Canada and a source of the furs that enriched New York merchants, making their alliance essential to colonial security and prosperity. Queen Anne's War, the American extension of the War of Spanish Succession raging in Europe, brought military concerns to the forefront in 1710. New York's position made it vulnerable to French and Native American attacks from Canada, and the colony had to contribute men and resources to military efforts that protected the northern frontier. The war also disrupted trade patterns and created both hardships and opportunities for colonial merchants. Religion and politics intertwined in complex ways. The Church of England enjoyed official status and government support, but the diverse population included Dutch Reformed, various dissenting Protestants, Catholics who practiced quietly, and Jews who maintained their own traditions. Religious tolerance, greater in New York than in most colonies, reflected practical necessity in a diverse society rather than any principled commitment to freedom of conscience. As 1710 drew to a close, New York stood at a critical juncture in its development. The small colonial town at the tip of Manhattan Island was growing, diversifying, and connecting ever more firmly to the Atlantic economy that would shape its future. The conflicts and compromises of this period were establishing patterns that would persist for generations, creating the foundations upon which a great city would eventually rise. The New York of 1710 was a place of contradictions. Freedom and slavery coexisted, sometimes in the same household. Diverse cultures mingled in the streets, while maintaining separate identities in homes and churches. Opportunity beckoned to those with resources and connections, while poverty and bondage constrained the lives of many others. This was a colonial society in formation, creating itself through the interactions of peoples from 3 continents, and setting the stage for transformations that no one in 1710 could have predicted. The story of New York in 1710 is ultimately a human story, populated by individuals whose names are mostly lost to history, but whose collective efforts built a town that would become a city, that would become a symbol recognized around the world. Their struggles, their achievements, their failures, and their compromises all contributed to the New York that exists today, and understanding their world helps us understand our own.